Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another installment of Rev War Revelry with Emerging Revolutionary War. Mark Malloy here. Very glad to have back on Gary Ecelbarger, who's going to be talking about a new book. We had him here about a year ago to talk about his two-volume set that's about George Washington's momentous year. I actually just recently re-listened to it to prep for this talk, and it was a really good conversation. And these books are focused on the year from July 4th, 1777 to July 4th, 1778. I'm really excited to get a copy of this the second volume, which in our last conversation, the volumes are kind of split up between July and December of 1777, and then December 1777 to July 1778. So tonight, we are going to be talking about the second volume that's coming out, which will cover, like I said, that second half of Washington's momentous year. So welcome, Gary. Yeah, can you give us a little, just a brief overview of some of the things that this book is gonna tap into, and then we can kind of go in chronologically through some of the stuff that you investigate.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting me back on. Almost exactly or close to a year since the first volume. The second volume just was released about 6 weeks ago, so it's freshly published and available. And it's a bigger book than the first volume. I didn't initially intend that to happen, but even though it covers 7 months versus 5 months, the first volume was the entire Philadelphia campaign through Whitemarsh, and then the volume two begins with the departure from Whitemarsh of Washington's army crossing the Schuylkill River for their brief encampment, 6-day encampment at what is called the Gulf Mills, and then from there to Valley Forge. So volume two, I would say 90% of that book is really about two topics: the 6-month encampment at Valley Forge, mostly again from the headquarters perspective, and followed by the Monmouth campaign, which we'll say begins on June 18th, takes you through the Battle of June 28th, and then it carries on for the next 6 days, leading to the 4th of July celebration on the Raritan River.
No, that's something that from your first volume that I really enjoy, the perspective that you take of kind of looking at it from the headquarters perspective, and kind of getting that sense of where Washington is getting information from, and kind of get into his mind as far as decision making. And so yeah, kind of take us through, I guess that first thing you mentioned, is the movement of Washington's army. So he had fought, these battles, obviously the Philadelphia campaign and then Whitemarsh. What's his mindset? And take us through basically how he ends up choosing to go to this place, Valley Forge. And we can get into Valley Forge because it becomes, in military history, it's probably the most famous encampment of all time. But how does he end up choosing to go to this place called Valley Forge?
Okay, well, the after the Battle of Whitemarsh, which is fought from December 5th through December 8th, and remember, I think we've talked about this before. I look at tactical outcomes on battles. I don't believe in draws. If you own the battlefield at the end of the day, if you're whoever had the objective of knocking the defender off of a battlefield, or if they both meet jointly at the same battle, who's the one that holds the ground at the end? By that definition, Washington has won the Battle of Whitemarsh, even though it's a very small contest overall. But Howe has been unable to, General Howe, William Howe has been unable to dislodge Washington from those heights. The key about Whitemarsh is that Washington at this time has 24,000 troops.
Hmm.
24,000. In other words, his army at Whitemarsh is larger than the civilian population of New York City, which was the second largest population center in the United States at the time. So Washington wasn't collecting 17 brigades of infantry and all that militia and artillery and cavalry to go into winter encampment. He was planning to attack Philadelphia. But how, in fact, up to how challenging him at Whitemarsh, Washington was seeping in closer to the city, and Howe beat him to the punch essentially for a whole different reason. But as it turns out, Washington after Whitemarsh decided that his commanders weren't really warm to an offensive campaign that was going to last through the winter, and here we already are in going into the second week of December. So he will put his army across the Schuylkill. Now, I don't know exactly when he decided on Valley Forge to be the encampment site because he had queried his generals about it in a council on November 30th, and he had a variety of answers from them, from Wilmington to Lancaster. Only one of the generals mentioned anything that even came close to where Valley Forge was, which was the region around the Tredyffin. Is I think it was one of his generals that mentioned that. That was the only one that came really close. But it looks like it was finally announced on December 15th while they were at the Gulf encampment. But what's interesting about it is, and I've never been able to solve this even when I wrote it, is the Gulf was was intended to be a one night encampment, and then they were going to move on. All right. Where they were going to move on to, who knows? But they intended to stay overnight on the 13th and move out on the 14th. That got delayed. Then they intended to move out again on the 16th, and that got delayed until the morning of the 19th. So what intended to be an overnight encampment, which was really just that's why the soldiers didn't even have tents for the first couple days because they weren't supposed to stay at the Gulf. Turned out to be close to a week, almost a week, 6 nights at the Gulf. But it was announced on the 15th that Valley Forge, which is only depending on where you were in the Gulf. I mean, there's a lot of troops encamped at the Gulf. So if you were at the closest portion to Valley Forge, it was about a 6 mile hike to get there, and if you were further away, it was about 9 or 10 miles to arrive from Valley Forge at the Gulf. So either way, it was all within a day's march to get there, and so they'll move there on the morning of the 19th from the Gulf
And
to Valley Forge.
and the location of Valley Forge and having been up there, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is just the some of the landscape features there is there are these kind of large hills in that area. Was it a naturally defensible location, or I guess kind of what went into his mindset on why Valley Forge? I
Well,
guess.
he spells that out in one of his letters to Congress, and essentially says he wanted to be close enough to the British to disrupt any of their forage operations. That was kind of a key essential. In addition to offering his men a good ground for them to have a winter encampment. Now remember, and this has been brought out in some very recent books, and it's very important to mention. His previous winter encampments were where his army would be spread out, and the men would be housed in different areas, spread out through different towns. This will be the first military encampment in which they're going to build their huts and actually make it as one of the soldiers said, a great continental city. It's the first attempt to do that, and that's what made Valley Forge so unique, is that it was an intended constructed city to serve Washington's army, with huts and little avenues that hooked you up between the different areas of the huts, and it was supposed to sustain the army. And when you think about it, they had borders along the Schuylkill because the Schuylkill did a bend from east to west, then moved south, and that kind of bordered part of Valley Forge. And it had a nice high plateau to it, so it wasn't going to be an area that flooded out very easily, even though the region closest to Valley Creek could. And there was plenty of wood available at the time for them to use as fuel and to build their huts as well. But it was within 20 miles of Philadelphia as the crow flies, and that was one of his chief concerns, was to stay close enough to Philadelphia. And as I discovered, one of the reasons for that is that he planned to attack Philadelphia and actually wrote out attack orders within the first few days of arriving at Valley Forge. So he never really intended to even stay at Valley Forge. If he was successful in capturing Philadelphia, then he would winter in Philadelphia.
Wow, that's really interesting. And, it doesn't surprise me. Of course, Washington, the previous winter, had his, wintertime campaign at Trenton and Princeton, and that kind of bold push for action, is something I think that really comes out, especially after. From the first volume, talking about Germantown. I mean, that it is just such a bold maneuver to take these guys and be able to push them. So that's really interesting. And what are some of the reasons, I guess, why he doesn't go through with that attack? Is it some of his other officers dissuading him from doing that? Is it weather, or I guess what are some of those reasons why?
Well, let's I'll just bring this out a little bit. I wrote a JAR article about this, and it actually covers a chapter in the book. It's essentially putting a lot of my book is putting a timeline onto onto events that are well discussed in other books. I mean, Valley Forge is well written about, but it's usually got thematic approaches to it, chapter covering supplies and chapter covering hut building. And it really, if you put a timeline to things, even to the Cabal, which occurred primarily during Valley Forge, you get a whole new concept of the story that leads you into the next campaign and a better appreciation of it. And I bring all this up for a reason. And I saw this and I had to download it, even though it's not in my book. I got to read this to you. I was working on a presentation, and I wanted to quote one of Washington's aides about the Monmouth campaign, and the line was that Washington was, quote, anxious to bring on a general engagement. And I've got to read you from AI. This is the AI version of this. Are you ready for this? This explains what you're talking about. The idea that Washington was, quote, anxious to bring on a general engagement is inaccurate and misrepresents his overall military strategy during the Revolutionary War. While he desired decisive victories, his approach was largely cautious, and he often avoided direct, large scale battles against superior British forces. So what this tells you is that historians don't have to worry about AI. Our jobs are safe because AI is not accurate. Because it generalizes and assumes that that was Washington's philosophy for the entire war, right? So his philosophy in 77 and 78 is, even when he has 20,000 men or 17,000 men, he's always thinking offensively. He's looking for the avenue of attack. And that's very consistent from the moment he left the Brandywine battlefield and lost that battle on the defensive. Everything after that was offensive minded, carrying him all the way through the Gulf to Valley Forge, and even then with the Monmouth campaign. Just consider it as a continuous tactical offensive idea, mindset, where Washington was always looking for that avenue to attack. This leads us to the planned attack on Philadelphia. He This has been dismissed by other historians. One of them, a prominent Valley Forge historian of yesteryear, actually suggested that he had too much Madeira at headquarters, or even hemp, to even come up with this plan, because they thought that he was way under strength. And that's when they thought he only had 11 or 12,000 men. And we've worked, Mike Harris and I have worked for years on this now, and we've shown and we've talked about this last year, is that his army was much larger than what's ever been appreciated before. So he's got an army that's generally larger than Howe's on most occasions during the Philadelphia campaign, and certainly at this stage right here. And he doesn't collect all these men to go into winter quarters. He wants to plan the attack. So, because, as I said, at Whitemarsh, his generals weren't really warm to an offensive campaign for the winter, Washington didn't call a council of war for this. He just planned it. And the only evidence we have of it is a plan that's docketed in his papers, listing on the morning of the 25th of December. It would be Christmas morning, right? It would be basically Trenton Redux minus a day, where Washington would plan this attack. And it was a pretty elaborate attack plan. And he started out the first phase of it. And to make a long story short, 6,000 men, which would be Sterling and militia and Smallwood, would draw the British out from their foraging operation at Derby, draw them in with Fabian tactics, while Washington and the remaining 13,000 to 14,000 men would cross the Schuylkill, probably at Matson's and Swedes Ford, drop down to the Germantown area, and probably set up to launch that attack on Christmas morning, a surprise attack against the British defenses. And the reason why they wanted to do this is because, and they determined this accurately, is that the forage operation occurring at Derby on the west side of the Schuylkill River by the Crown forces was an 8,000 man operation, including General Howe involved with this. So he's across the Schuylkill from Philadelphia with almost half of his available army because the other parts of the army are in New Jersey. So Washington determined he's got a very little window of opportunity to launch this attack where he really has this incredible numerical advantage over the force that's in Philadelphia. That's why he wanted to do this, and works on the plan really quickly, decides not to call a council of war about it. He's just going to start to enact the plan. What knocked it out and basically killed any offensive strategy that Washington would have for the rest of the winter season and actually for much of the early spring was a simultaneous collapse of the commissary and quartermaster departments, which had been teetering toward that for weeks, but this both happened at the same time. And with this huge population center, Washington didn't have enough flour and beef to feed them, and he had to call it off. He resolved that
Hmm.
problem quickly with a 1,400 man forage operation. And I could say that because for the rest of December and for January, he did bring in 2 million pounds of foodstuffs each month into Valley Forge. So he was successful at maintaining his army at least for the early winter months. But that very real and severe shortage, the simultaneous collapse of wagons to bring in supplies and of the supplies themselves, just killed any chance he had of conducting the operation. And so he
Hmm.
docketed the plan, and nobody ever talked about it again. So I think he kept it to himself and whatever aide he worked with to write it out, probably Tench Tillman.
Interesting. No, that's and you're right. You know, the common story I think is, yeah, that Washington is this cautious general, but yeah, you see things like I said, you know, he and I can only imagine too, having seen his army on the verge of collapse the year before, he's got to press every advantage he has when he has the manpower that he has. But that's really fascinating too. The how logistics is
Right.
really going to end up playing a key role in decision making. And logistics, of course, is also a huge issue just with the Valley Forge encampment overall. So how do you yeah, cover the in the book? How do you cover the Valley Forge encampment? Are you looking at it like you mentioned? You know, there's been a lot written about Valley Forge, so kind of how do you look at the encampment overall? Are you looking at those things like the logistical issues that the headquarters is having throughout those months that they're encamped there? Because ultimately that's going to lead to a lot of problems. But then, you know, I know people like Nathaniel Green are going to play an important role in turning things around. But one of the things that Valley Forge I think is most famous for is just the destitution that people often remember, kind of the vision of Valley Forge as this place where there was so little supplies, and the fact that so many men die during the encampment as well. So kind of how do you handle Valley Forge in the book?
And well, remember, for everything you said, remember for everything that's been written about Valley Forge, magnify it by 50% because that was the assumption that the Army came in at 12,000 and dwindled down to 6,000 and then grew to right before they departed from Monmouth. And really, the Army came in at 19,000 because you count, they never count anything beyond rank and file, present and fit for duty. But if you look at all the mouths you have to feed in the encampment, they came in at 19,000 plus another 3,000 or so, counting Smallwood's men in Wilmington and three independent regiments that go to Lancaster. They all have to get supplied as Continental troops, and then the cavalry, which ends up moving over to Trenton, they got to get supplied as well. So all those logistics played mostly for the Valley Forge encampment, but you have to think about all the surrounding encampment sites peripheral to it, which is about four or five of those that you had to keep supplies and wagons rolling for this. So remember, that's the large part of it. I don't think that army ever dwindled much lower than, in fact, I put this in an appendix in the book. It was always over 14,000 officers and men at Valley Forge. It never got lower than that. So it was probably about the equivalent at its lowest of the third largest population center in the United States, which was Boston at the time, right? But it grew. It started out big, dropped, and then grew almost to the exact same size that it was when they came in. Now, so my story is quite different than the tradition that you hear about the phoenix rising from the ashes, right? That they came in all destitute with bloody footprints in the snow, and then they leave rejuvenated and embark on this campaign, well trained by Baron de Steuben and ready to go. My story is a little bit different, and I of course claim my story is accurate when I put it in this perspective, is that they really left it about the same numerical strength as they came in, and I think they, except for two occasions in this little December issue I talked about, and then definitely in the second week of February, it was even a worse shortage that ended up lasting almost a week. But other than that, the Army probably was adequately supplied. If you look at the consumption of foodstuffs, they actually were fairly well supplied, except for those two occasions. And I never was able to understand the wagon deficiencies that are brought up. Apparently, at one time in February, and I cite this, it's now I use it as a secondary source, but everybody else talks about it, is that for a brief time in February, they only had 8 wagons in Valley Forge. Now, they had a 900 reserve wagon park at Bethlehem in October as a reserve, in addition to their several hundred wagons that were with the Army. So I have no idea what happened to 1,500 wagons that they couldn't have an operating wagon system just a few months later. But probably it was had to deal with the Teamsters to drive them, and also the number of available animals to feed them. That probably had a lot to do with it, and providing adequate forage for those horses that had to go with the wagons as well. But that was my story with Valley Forge. I think if you're going to ask me overall, I'm going to say it generally. Um, Valley Forge definitely, the Army got sharpened and honed. They definitely had that brotherhood developing. They definitely had hardships that they had to deal with over time. The disease definitely went through. You talked about the deaths. The deaths actually escalated in the spring more than in the winter because of the spread of disease in the close-knit quarters that they had. And my guess is that typhus probably had a lot to do with it. And we get to appreciate this now more with COVID, when you have disease spread among soldiers that are kind of cramped in quarters. And it got so bad that Washington really converted a lot of his troops out of he first tried to fix up the cabins, put windows in them, burn gunpowder, do everything they could to be more sanitary and get rid of the smells. And then he shifted a lot of men to tents, and then he just shifted most of them across the Schuylkill River to the north side where they were on June 10th and spent the rest of the encampment there. Not everybody, but the majority of the troops. That was a way to relieve the 6 month strain on Valley Forge itself. So when the army left Valley Forge at the same strength that it came in, you could say, okay, well, they're the same strength, but they got trained. They did and they didn't, right? I think the veterans that left Valley Forge with Washington, and let's say I'll put that number somewhere around 11,000 or so. Of that 19,000 19,000 that Washington will carry into New Jersey. I think they were well-trained veterans from 77, whether it was the Saratoga campaign or the Philadelphia campaign. Those are the best soldiers he's ever had to this stage in the Revolution because they're vets and they've been well-trained. And they've been trained over time, beginning in March all the way to June. But there are 5,000 men that leave with the army that have never been in a battle before. They're all the new levies and recruits and draftees that have come in, and 3,000 of them came after May 1st. And I would say most of those weren't very well trained, if they got trained at all. So there's a lot of dead weight that's moving with this army. And it's a prelude to me saying that Washington has to find a way to solve that problem, and he comes up with a kind of an ingenious way of doing that during the Monmouth campaign. But he's got a split source. You got a well-trained veteran army and new recruits that to some degree some got training and some didn't. And overall, because of the loss of a lot of veterans whose service was up and they left, um, 7 brigades were numerically weaker leaving Valley Forge than they were coming in. 7 out of the 17. So 40% of his infantry brigades were numerically weaker. That's the 4 Virginia brigades, that's Wayne's 2 Pennsylvania brigades, and that's Varnum's Rhode Island brigade. And what they got weaker because they lost all their veterans. So I
Yeah.
would say that it's I always tell people, did the phoenix rise from the ashes at Valley Forge? I'll say, yeah, the phoenix rose from the ashes, but that great mythical bird probably hovered more than it soared.
No, that's fascinating. And yeah, everything with Valley Forge, there is this kind of aura of myth around a lot of it that you kind of have to cut through. And there's of course there's the stories of how it being a snowy winter encampment, whereas I know other historians have found that it actually wasn't that cold or that snowy compared, especially to other encampments. But what you're saying too about finding that it wasn't as destitute as it's been portrayed through many histories. I think that's really fascinating. And then also
Well,
the so
I would say, as far as the destitute, I don't want to leave the impression that it was a rosy scenario. I mean, there definitely were the problems with the soldiers in terms of their conditions. And I will actually brush back when everybody says, well, the weather conditions weren't so bad. They were bad enough because mud and ice and that mix was just as bad as a hard freeze at times. And I think when the roads get stopped because of that, because of thaws and then refreezes, you can't bring wagons into the camp even when you have them available. They just can't be moved. There are times when men are serving as the horses, or actually have the yokes on them, pulling on wagons because there's just not a lot of horses available. So I think the hardships were definitely real. I think the weather, there were really cold days there, and to me, even though the average temperature might have been several degrees warmer than it was, let's say, at Morristown 2 years later, still cold enough when you're in a cabin that you built for the first time. And if you're not huddled near the fireplace and you're stuck at the door, there could be a 20-degree difference in temperature overnight. So I think the men had it rough. Now, remember though, I don't really tell that story so much from the soldier standpoint. I tell it from headquarters and how they have to deal with it. And remember, Washington had to deal with the growing cabal against him. So he's got the enemy at his back as well as the enemy in his front. So he's got all those issues to deal with at the same time.
Yeah, and yeah, I want to talk about the cabal, but one other question about just the soldiers too, because you talk about the numbers of the soldiers going in and coming out. Did you look at all about the amount of deaths that actually do happen? Because I've seen various numbers thrown out there as whether it was 1,000 or 2,000 men who
Well,
died during.
I added them up from all the returns. I found uh 27 returns.
Oh,
Okay,
wow.
just about every single week, and they have a running count on the deaths and discharges. So remember, most of the time when a soldier died, a Valley Forge soldier died, he didn't die at Valley Forge. He wasn't buried there, even if he did die there. But most of them died in outlying hospitals. So we'll call them Valley Forge deaths, even though they
Yeah.
probably occurred outside the camp. And I came up with just between January 1st, where I had a reliable number, to through June 13th. So I'm missing the last 5 days. And remember, 15 people were dying a day, 17 people were dying a day in June. So I'm missing those last 5 days. And I don't have the first 10 days of December. But from the Valley Forge encampment itself, I added up 1,940 something, I believe. But that doesn't
Oh,
count
wow.
Smallwood's guys in Wilmington. So easily it got over 2,000. And that doesn't include the non-military personnel like Teamsters or camp followers that died as well. So I'm convinced well over 2,000 people died in that 6 months. So when you look at the total number of people that died in the war, right? What was it, 25,000 or so? And it was I think it was like 17 or 18,000 non-battle deaths versus 8,000 battle deaths. To have 2,000 men die in that 6 month period, I don't think that rate is exceeded uh, maybe by some of the men, maybe by, in a 6 month spread by the men on the prison ships from those
Mhm.
captures in the 76 New York campaign. But I think that might not even get there. I think for a 6 month period, the amount of deaths at Valley Forge was probably the highest of any 6 month period in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, no, and I think that's part of the reason why it's been remembered is because of this massive loss of life. And you're right. I mean, yeah, especially with, and compared to any battles, I mean, yeah, this is a huge blow.
Well, can
And
I add one more thing? Can I add one
yeah.
more thing about the blow? When I was talking about the quality of the men that were leaving, a lot of men that had to be left behind because even though they've solved the quartermaster and commissary eventually, there still were by the end of May, there still were over 1,000 men inadequately clothed, and they were
Mhm.
probably part of the 3,500 that were left behind when the Army went out to New Jersey. So who won't have the clothes? The new recruits or the vets that have been marching all that time? It's probably good veterans that were probably healthy soldiers, but couldn't embark on the campaign because they just didn't have shoes to go out, right? So I think they had to be left behind. And the other thing I want to bring up is that I remember I said Washington has 17 brigades. He only has 9 brigadier generals to lead them. So almost half of his brigades are led by somebody other than a brigadier general, a lower rank. And he only has 5 field commanders that are major generals, and only Sterling has any significant battle experience leading at least 2 brigades. Because you look at
Hmm.
Steuben, you look at Lafayette, you look at Charles Lee, who just got out of prison for 16 months. And I'm who am I forgetting off the top of my head? But of those 5, only Sterling is only Sterling has any significant battle experience as a major general commanding a division.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
no, that's
so my point is they're really a lot weaker than we think going out on that campaign.
yeah. All right, so before we get into Monmouth, yeah, tell me about the Cabal, and
Okay,
how you cover that in this book, and if it differs from any of the other things that have been written about this. Was it a real Cabal, and was how close did they get, and how did Washington stop this, I guess, from being pushed out from his position.
Okay, and I won't make this too long because the uh, one of my favorite books of all time, and I keep telling Mark Lender this, because he really did a great job with solving that issue. His book Cabal, like 2018 or 2019, and even 15 years before that, Fleming's book about Washington's secret war, they do a great job of explaining the cabal, and it is real, but real to this sense only. It wasn't a clandestine operation going on behind Washington's back. It was a board of war truly trying to take power away from Washington, but doing it with congressional approval. So the cabal was that it was the measures taken by the board of war to usurp Washington's authority on several different measures and put it under the auspices of the Board of War in York, where Congress was convening at the time as well, just hundreds of yards away. And so everything that the Board of War was recommending, Congress was approving. So it wasn't any. So we think of a cabal as this underhanded operation that was being done below, below the radar, if I can get anachronistic about it. This case, it wasn't. They were all doing it for what they thought was for the good of the army, but it definitely was an attempt to take away Washington's authority. Now, the two chief people involved with it were the two major players on the Board of War, which was Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, the Northern Department, and he obviously had a quest for power. And Thomas Mifflin, who mostly was doing this probably out of revenge, but they were working together to do that. And I would look at the cabal as four different methods that were taking away Washington's authority. One was creating the inspector generalship that Washington had recommended at the end of October and putting it under the auspices of the Board of War. The second one was creating a competing commissary department that was basically going to take over the state commissary of Pennsylvania and Washington's commissary department. And a third one was a subdivided quartermaster department that the Board of War was going to oversee as well. And then the fourth one was this incursion or interruption into Canada, which was another military operation, which would take away a lot of Washington's best officers on an operation that would be commanded, overseen by the Board of War and commanded by generals that they had chosen, and taken away from Washington's Valley Forge force while he is trying to strengthen his army for the upcoming campaign. So all of that was going on with approval of Congress for the most part. And that's what Washington had to deal with. He's learning about all of these things, and he has to try to hold on to what is necessary for the army to function at its peak. And the way he saw it is the army functioned at its peak when the commanding general had authority over all of those departments, the commissary, the quartermaster, and the inspector generalship.
Huh.
So that's what Washington had to deal with. So that part of the cabal is very real. There's another part of the cabal, and that's why you call it the Conway cabal, is all the nasty accusations and critiques of Washington. Well, that's natural if you're not seeing your commander as successful. It's not uncommon for politicians, especially opinionated ones, or other prominent citizens like the Benjamin Rushes of the world to complain about it. That's not really the cabal, but it kind of feeds into it. All right. So the cabal was the attempts by the Board of War to take the power.
Huh. Yeah, no, that's and then I guess so how does that end up, because and this is something you mentioned in our last discussion that one of the typical stories is that coming out of the Valley Forge campaign as Washington goes to strike at the British in New Jersey at Monmouth, is that was the moment that Washington put to rest all these attempts to usurp his power and solidified his generalship of the Continental Army. But
Well,
you
if
mentioned
I if
that,
if I if I actually said, I think I was trying to say that that the cabal had basically ended well before then. and that he
Yeah.
didn't
So
need that camp.
how
Say again.
I
I'm
said
saying
how
he
did
didn't.
the
Okay, here's a
how did
my
uh,
my point is that the general traditional view is that Washington needed the Monmouth campaign to show that he was the ultimate commander of the army and needed no challengers. I found that not to be true, or at least I'm not buying into that at all, because I think the cabal was well settled months before that, and that he is the undisputed commander of the army in control of all of those departments, and that he didn't need the campaign to solidify his power. He wasn't his authority wasn't being questioned any longer with the Board of War or with Congress since the winter months. And in other words, what I found by putting a timeline to it, because Lender's book, for example, does his chapters thematically. So you'll go back in time, and each theme goes back to it's not in chronological order. When I put it in chronological order, Mark, I found something that was really interesting, and this would probably cut against the grain of people considering that I was being a homer for Washington. I don't think the cabal was solved by any political genius of George Washington at all. I think he got lucky. I really do, and
hmm,
here's why. Um, he solved the inspector generalship by refusing to acknowledge the authority of the inspector general that the Board of War sent to train his army. That was Thomas Conway, and it's because he hated Conway. He even says, "I consider him my enemy." So if it was an officer that Washington didn't hate as much, there might have been more of a not an open arm invitation, but there might have been more of a meeting of the minds to allow some training to have occurred before Baron de Steuben arrived. But he kept Conway out of the camp primarily because of his hatred of him, which goes back to the Philadelphia campaign. And remember, Conway got promoted over many generals that ranked him in the brigadier general department. He was made major general against everybody's wishes about that. So Washington refused to recognize him. And you know what's ironic about it is that when Washington first authorized or recommended the office of inspector general at the end of October, he did this as a result of a council of war that he held, and he had all of his generals in that council sign that document that it was to serve under his authority. Thomas Conway signed that document as a brigadier general serving under Washington. And here he is a few
hmm,
months later coming in as the major general from the Board of War standpoint to basically stick it to Washington that the inspector general is going to serve under us and not you. So Washington refused to
hmm,
acknowledge that. And when Baron de Steuben came in and Washington recognized that he was the guy for this, he would be made the de facto inspector general, even though he couldn't technically do that until Conway was out of the picture. Conway made it easy for everybody when he tendered his resignation, probably as a threat, but Congress quickly accepted it because everybody had enough of Conway at that time. So by April, he's
yeah.
out of the army, and Baron de Steuben is accepted as the inspector general. As far as the quartermaster and commissary, what I found, and I think I'm the first to discover this, is that at the end of January, they already had the committee at camp, the five members of Congress that went near Valley Forge. They actually went to Moore Hall, which is 3 miles west of Washington's headquarters. It's where the house still stands. It's in Phoenixville today, and that's where they met and where Washington came out most of the time to meet with them. And they were five members of Congress that were pretty open to Washington's recommendations. And they actually went against congressionally approved um, legislation recommended by the Board of War. So when the Board of War recommended a competing commissary department, some of the members of the committee at camp, which was this five-member congressional group that came to at the end of January to meet with Washington, they probably voted for that on January 13th back at York, and they completely disregarded it and went by Washington's recommendations at the end of January, and that's how we ended up with with a new commissary general of Washington's liking there, which they had settled on it at the end of January and it became official in March. So that was solved. The more interesting part was the quartermaster department. Now, the committee of camp was initially supposed to have three members of the Board of War. And that would have been a big problem for Washington because those three members were supposed to be Gates and Mifflin, the two people that were Washington's greatest critics and basically would have really made a mess of this whole thing, and Timothy Pickering. And you might think, well, wasn't Timothy Pickering part of Washington's staff in 77? He was, and he was a huge critic of Washington. So that would have been three members that were very critical of Washington's performance and of his basic functions, and they would have really fought hard against Washington's recommendations. They got tied up with Board of War duties. Lender kind of suggests that it was their way of getting out of going to the committee to prevent any huge problems, but I think it was a real event. They really did have to work on this invasion of Canada, which eventually didn't happen. So they did have to meet in York to do that. And so they were replaced by other members of Congress. So the members of Congress that ended up there, none of them were adverse to Washington, even though we're led to believe that a couple of them were and that Washington turned them within the first few days, like Francis Dana. There appears to be not the case. I mean, Washington did play on Dana's sympathies a little bit in the first couple of days. And I will say to Washington's credit, even though he had to scramble to do this, he did have to work on what we will call a state paper with Alexander Hamilton, one of 13,000 words, with all of his recommendations of all the problems that were occurring in the Army. Chief among those was Mifflin's abandonment of the quartermaster department. So if Mifflin was there, this would have been a big problem, of course. And so they were able to expand on this. So while they're in meetings about this in early February, Congress in York approves of that subdivided quartermaster department serving under the board. And they send this document, this legislation to the camp committee and to Washington. And Washington and the camp committee receive it on February 13th and they sit on it. They pretend like they don't even see it, like they're not going to acknowledge it. And the reason for this, and this is the new information I have, is one day before that, the board, committee of camp at Moore Hall had a special visitor. And he came and he sat and talked about the quartermaster department, and they offered him the job as quartermaster general, a job he accepted about a month and a half later, and that's Nathaniel Greene. So most people don't recognize that Greene was actually offered that position in fairly early in February, right before he went on the Grand Forge to complete the rest of the month. And so when when the camp committee in Washington received the congressional legislation approving the Board of War subdivided quartermaster department, they thought at that time, nope, we got a better idea, and they sat on it for about a week and a half, and then they wrote back. They didn't name Greene, but they said we have interviewed somebody for this who we think is we're going to hold on this legislation. We think we have somebody that's better for the position. So my point in all this, to make a long story short, is I think Washington was very fortunate to not have any members of the Board of War come, and that the committee of camp happened to be there during that second huge collapse of the commissary and quartermaster department in the second week of February, which they got to see firsthand and realized as a body of five that without a doubt all the commissary and quartermaster issues have to be under Washington's direct control and not overseen by a body 80 miles away. And they only really appreciated that because they were right there to witness the collapse.
Hmm. No, that's really fascinating. And, all those kinds of internal politics, I mean, that's got to be so difficult for Washington with all of the other things that he's dealing with to have, as we said, kind of like an enemy in the back that he's got to constantly be fighting with, um, that just makes his job very difficult.
Right,
Um,
but I'll also say is that by the end of February, all those issues are fairly resolved. Clearly by March, when he's got de Steuben working as his inspector general, and there is no a body in Congress or the board that's really challenging Washington's authority at this stage. That comes later on when Charles Lee gets paroled, and
yeah,
he's going to kind of stir the pot. But until then, everything with Congress and the board is you'll still have Washington critics, but they're fairly quiet. And I think what really have to appreciate is by the late spring, when Gates is going to be put back in the Northern Department, and Mifflin is going to be coming under question for what happened in the Quartermaster Department, and he's going to get a congressional investigation as well. Um, the Board of War essentially breaks up. Okay, so there's going to be no future threat of the 1778 Board of War against Washington's authority. It's already kind of defunct with Gates's new role, and Gates and Washington become correspondents after that.
yeah. No, yeah, that's really interesting. But one of the big things that happens, of course, and I think it changes the whole war, is when they get word that France uh, is
Right.
going to come in and make an alliance with them. How big a deal was that? And then how does that set up what eventually becomes the Battle of Monmouth?
Well, the French recognition, I always say the French recognition definitely was the key to the tide turning in the revolution. But not because it initially gave great supplies and a huge body of French troops to the Americans, at least into the summer of 78, but because it had to divert all British forces to cover the Caribbean and other areas and actually force them to withdraw from Philadelphia. That was really the
Yeah.
key to that. If that didn't happen, you never know how long Clinton now, who replaces Howe, is going to stay there. So he's ordered to evacuate Philadelphia because of that. So when Washington learns of that, and the news arrives late. I mean, this was approved in February,
Yeah.
and um, uh, they learn about it at the end of April. So it miscarried the first news of it. And so when Washington learns about this, they're going to celebrate it at Valley Forge with a huge event on May 6th, including a feu de joie, that big fire of joy, well coordinated by Baron de Steuben's training, and it becomes one of the most joyous days in the camp. But there's no question about French recognition having that huge impact and actually sparking the next campaign that occurs in New Jersey right after it. And it looks like you're
Yes.
frozen right there. Are you there? Oh,
But
okay. You're frozen there for a second, but that was the impact of it. Um, Early on, I don't think the French supplies. You get suggestions that the Americans were already well armed with weapons and everything that came from France. You know, there's a report in early February of over 3,000 bayonets that are missing from muskets. So I think they still have their original weapons, at least well into the Valley Forge encampment. I'm a little dubious. They're not well uniformed leaving Valley Forge as well. So I think all that comes a little bit later.
and then as Clinton, of course, is going across New Jersey, is when Washington's going to strike at Monmouth, and I have the Leutze painting behind me of the
Yeah,
one of the dramatic moments of that engagement, which of course brings in. You mentioned Charles Lee. Charles Lee comes into this. How much of a threat was Charles Lee to Washington's power? And this um, uh, I don't know what you call it, the meeting of Washington and Lee at the Monmouth battlefield. And I know other historians, of course, have said that it's not as dramatic as it's been portrayed. But how important uh, was Charles Lee in this story? And how important was, what happened at the Battle of Monmouth with that whole dynamic between Washington and Lee?
I have a whole different take on Lee than what you're seeing in the literature. There's essentially been a little bit of a revision starting with Lee biographers who and then carried on by some by campaign historians that will follow along with Lee's claim that his orders were neither precise nor positive. I'll get into that in a few minutes. But what I got to learn to appreciate with Lee is that he was, remember he spent 16 months in captivity. I'm not even going to talk about his the all the treason that he committed and some of the very curious things because Washington didn't know about that. Okay, so
Yeah.
it had no impact on Washington's feeling at the time, but it shows that Charles Lee definitely has a huge respect for the British Army. He thought the British Army was the cream of the crop, and when he got into arguments with Steuben over it, for example, where Steuben said no, the Prussians are the better army, that upset Lee, and Lee kind of stirred the pot about having other people challenge Steuben's authority. At least that's kind of what the line of thinking that Steuben's biographer goes with, which, at least by a timeline, seems to make a lot of sense, even though I don't have direct evidence for it. I think Washington treated Lee quite a bit differently, and I think when Lee gets released after 16 months, the war has passed him by. Okay. If you look at Charles Lee, I mean, he definitely has been successful overall in the Charleston campaign, but as a field commander leading troops on a battlefield, the last time he led troops on a tactical offensive was 300 men in 1762. So the Revolutionary War has passed him by. All these big battles that have occurred at Brandywine and at Germantown and at least the facing off period at Whitemarsh and all that. Lee was out of the picture for all of that. And when Lee is paroled and then in April and then exchanged in May, he's trying to gain relevance again. And so he espouses all of his military theories, and he's finding that he doesn't have an audience for them anymore. So he's always critical of Washington because obviously, as one officer said, Lee is the second officer upon the continent. I always like that description because it's true. Washington's one and Lee's number two. And Washington welcomed him back with a huge event and open arms in early April at Valley Forge. But Lee, after just being there a day or two, has said that Washington wasn't even fit to command a sergeant's guard, and that he is going to espouse his plans when he goes to York. But he goes to York and he finds that when he starts being critical of Washington, it's already April. Remember, I said the cabal's done. They don't want to hear it. Okay, he even admits that he was a little surprised that he isn't gaining an audience on this anymore, and when he tries to talk about British superiority to the Board of War, they don't want to hear about it either. They're complaining about it. So Lee has this crazy idea, Mark, that the British aren't going to evacuate Philadelphia and go to New York like everybody's already believing. He maintains in three different letters, and he writes about this to Washington at great length, that they're going to feign in that direction and then head into the interior of Pennsylvania. They're going to threaten the Susquehanna region and pull themselves inward, first through Lancaster and then across at York and then work their way inward. And he won't get off of that notion at all. And he pushes that concept with Washington time and time again, up to June 15th. So when Washington holds a council on June 17th, the day before they leave Valley Forge, they leave on the 18th and the 19th. Washington offers the Council of Generals, in which Lee is one of the 16 that's in there, the options that the British may take evacuating Philadelphia. And guess what he does in front of Lee's face? And I'm the first that brings this up. He doesn't bring up Lee's theory at all. But in other words, he's telling Lee that he's just a blowhard, that
Hmm.
he's not the military genius that he thinks he is, that Washington's going to give him no consideration at all. He won't even bring up his theory in a council of war. So I
Hmm.
think that's Lee's first inkling, that he's going to be this isn't going to, Washington's trying to establish himself right away, and that he thinks the war's passed Lee by, and he doesn't consider Lee the great military genius that he thinks he is. So throughout the spread in New Jersey, we hear about the famous Council of War deep in New Jersey at Hopewell, where Lee says that a bridge of gold ought to be built to allow the British to pass through, or the Crown forces to get to New York, because we already have French recognition. It would be to the last degree criminal to get involved with a general engagement. But the truth is, what's his mindset? He's always looking for the general engagement. And there's plenty of examples in this campaign where that's going to occur as well. And he doesn't, look at the common sense, the big picture notion. He doesn't carry 21,000 officers and men into New Jersey to build a bridge of gold. He wants to hit that British army, and his plan is that he wants to strike it and see what Clinton's reaction will be if he strikes the rear. And if Clinton bites on that rear guard hit, he will either try to quell it with the rear guard by itself and move on, or he will commit to a full engagement. And so Washington tells Lee on the day of the battle that I'm ready to support you with the main army. I mean, what does that mean? When he means I'm going to support you with the main army, it doesn't mean the main army is going to come up and watch you and applaud you. They're there to help you if this thing develops into a full engagement, which means that Washington's prepared for that. He's not going to start a full engagement, but he's ready for the full engagement. And so that's what he's looking to do. So the battle plan that Washington has in mind is, if he needs to, is to goad Clinton into a full-scale engagement, and then Washington will battle him on the ground of his own choosing. And then Lee just blows apart that plan through his own sloppiness of carrying out Washington's orders. And the battle turns out differently than Washington planned in terms of where it was going to be fought, but basically the main concept of the British being drawn into his defensive line is exactly what he was looking for, just not at the spot where he expected it to be.
Who was the victor of the Battle of Monmouth?
Yeah, that's the other thing. I know that, as I said, there are no draws. So look at it this way. Who owns the battlefield at the end of the day? It's the Americans. Now, I want to take a different approach to this because, they'll say, well, the casualties were about the same. Well, first of all, Clinton underreported his losses. I mean, when you have two American accounts by officers independently, who they don't say we buried about 300, they said we buried 303. Pretty exact number, right? From two different sources. So I believe that they buried 303 when Clinton claims well under 250 buried. So already the casualty numbers are mounting there. But I have the British losses in the battle at somewhere around 500, a little less than that, or a little more, depending on if he counts the 45 wounded and left behind in Freehold as part of his casualty figures for wounded or missing. And Washington's probably are close to 400. So they're pretty close. You don't really judge the battle by that. You judge it by who owns the battlefield at the end of the day. And the key here is the way the Americans looked at it. To a man, in fact, I found 6 accounts of this already. If I looked for more, I would get it. They use the term, they left us masters of the field. When they use that term, it means this is the third time that a lot of these Continentals are watching the Redcoats turn their backs to the Americans on a battlefield and withdraw, and it elates them. Even people like Henry Knox, who called the idea of a general engagement criminal, finally sees the light and understands that it was a splendid affair, and that the world will see that the Americans can stand toe to toe with any army. And that's the way we got to look at this battle, because when Washington owns that battlefield at the end of the day, they are left masters of the field, because Clinton, who is on that battlefield at night, can, with a 20-degree temperature drop, he's got a whole fresh division that he can bring in the next morning. If he truly believes that Washington is this incompetent Mr. Washington who he could rout from a battlefield, this is his last opportunity of the war, because where's he going? New York. He's going to be laid under siege, and he's never going to have the open field opportunity of beating Washington in an open field battle than he will if he just stays till the following morning, has his fresh division that's been resting since the essentially since the night of the 26th, battle on the 29th, and lead assaults against either open flank that Washington has. But Clinton doesn't want any part of it, and he will evacuate the battlefield beginning at midnight, and that definitely leaves Washington in charge. Washington won that battle, no
And
question about
you
it.
end this book with July 4th, 1778. And you mentioned in the first volume that it's almost not even noticed in 1777, the
Right.
4th of July, that it wasn't celebrated. But by this point, you know, they do a celebration to mark the independence of the United States that July 4th.
Right. Essentially where Rutgers University is now at on the New Brunswick side. Washington's on across the Raritan on the Piscataway campus side. And he's watching the event. It's actually since it's about what is it? About 6 weeks after the great celebration they had for French recognition, they're well practiced for this feu de joie that they hold. But the entire army of 17,000 men that's available there will line up in in two lines of celebration, well over 2 miles across each way. And they're all facing toward Washington across the river. And he watches this whole event. But the soldiers that write about this in their pension applications 50 years later mark that event as if they were marking a battle. They talk about the great 4th of July celebration on the Raritan. And two of them say when we celebrated the 4th of July and our American independence and our great victory at the Battle of Monmouth. So they still, in other words, Monmouth is it wasn't the complete victory that we expect in battles in the Revolutionary War or other wars, but there are a lot of war battles like that. But definitely, I consider it a tactical victory by the Americans and clearly a strategic one for them for the benefit of their army. But again, I'm going to say not so. I mean, for Washington, he realized at that stage that um, even when he had suspect seconds in command that weren't carrying out his orders the way he wanted them to, that when he felt his army was strong enough now, both in numbers and in skill, that he could stand toe to toe with the best armies in the world, and he didn't think they would ever lose again as long as he was on the field commanding them, and that was the key. Washington, when he got to that field, rallied that army in a way that you don't see in American history, except for a few events. It's what got Stonewall Jackson his nickname at the Battle of Manassas of turning a defeat into a victory. It's what you see with Sheridan's ride at the Battle of Cedar Creek or Blackjack Logan at the Battle of Atlanta. These are those rare moments when an individual turns a mass retreat and rallies troops and has the skill and wherewithal to set up three lines of defense. The first two lines, knowing that they're going to be sacrificial lambs just long enough for him to establish the main third line. So that's your point of woods and your hedgerow defense. And then by the time that that's swept away, there he is on that third line of defense at Prine's Hill. And there's no way you're going to knock him off that hill. And that's the key. Washington was marvelous that day. He had a tremendous day as a field commander. Unfortunately for him, and I guess for us, even though the war is going to last 5 more years, that's his last battle in which he led as a field commander. I don't count Yorktown because that's a siege. So if you're looking at a battle where there it is, 1778, and that's it for the rest of the war.
Yeah, no, and yeah, no, and
So he goes out on a high note from that end.
I think that's a perfect way to end our conversation here today too, because this is a great study. Thank you, Gary, for joining us and talking about this time period. I know we mentioned in the last one too. This time period's sometimes overlooked in Washington's career, but it's obviously some of the most significant parts of his military career. Valley Forge, Monmouth. So yeah, if you want to do a deep dive, get in the head of Washington in his headquarters with the decisions he's making. Pick up George Washington's Momentous Year, Volume 2. Gary, do you have anything else you want to part ways with before we sign off?
No, I think you've been kind enough to have me on for two straight years of discussions about my books. I won't overstay my welcome. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's
I appreciate
fantastic.
this
We
whole
love
event.
having you. All the research you do, bringing fresh perspectives into stuff that's been discussed a lot. But I really appreciate the all the original research, and yeah, really kind of taking it from Washington's perspective when you're looking at these time periods, because that's something that as historians, that's so valuable to look at what information he was getting at the time, how he made his decisions. Really helps you understand, why this was so significant. But yeah, no. So thank you, Gary, and yeah, pick up your copy of George Washington's Momentous Year,
All right.
and
Thanks, folks.
we will be in touch later. Thank you all.